Cabin in the Woods. True Scary Work Stories. Story 1. The Watcher. I worked as a caretaker for a remote cabin deep in the woods, tasked with maintaining it during the off-season. The isolation was initially peaceful, a welcome retreat from my busy city life. But as the days turned into weeks, an unsettling presence began to loom over my quiet refuge. One evening, as I was stoking the fire, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line watching me. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, amplifying the unease. Every night, the figure returned at the same time, its silhouette stark against the fading light. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the shadows, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. The woods whispered secrets I couldn't decipher, and I felt increasingly isolated. Finally, I decided to confront whatever it was. Armed with a flashlight and a surge of adrenaline, I stepped outside, heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with tension, and the usual sounds of the night seemed muted. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. As I moved closer to the tree line, the figure vanished. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Just as I turned to head back, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only darkness and silence. That night, the scratching at the cabin door began. It started as a faint noise, like fingernails on wood, but escalated to a relentless scratching that drove me to the brink of sanity. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the door, my heart racing. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a kitchen knife and tiptoed to the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible. Only silence answered. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside, but the darkness swallowed the porch whole. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped. I hardly slept that night, haunted by the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I packed my things and left the cabin behind. I never returned. Story 2. The Stained Walls. During a summer job preparing the cabin for guests, I discovered strange stains on the walls of the main room. They were dark, thick, and looked eerily like blood. At first, I assumed it was a prank left by previous renters or a result of a wild animal's misadventures. With each passing hour, however, the stains became increasingly unsettling. That night, as I lay in bed, I began hearing whispers weaving through the cabin, as if the very walls were alive. The sound was soft at first, barely perceptible, but grew louder and more insistent as darkness enveloped the room. My skin prickled with unease. I decided I had to paint over the stains, hoping to erase whatever sinister presence lingered. The next day, I set to work, rolling fresh white paint over the dark marks. But no matter how many coats I applied, the stains bled through, darker and more pronounced each time. It was as if the cabin was refusing to let go of its secrets. The whispers continued, now forming into words that seemed to echo my thoughts, taunting me. One night, as I lay awake, I heard the whispering turn into a chant. I could almost make out the words, but they were distorted and chilling. "Join us," it seemed to say, over and over, filling my mind with dread. I shut up in bed, my heart racing, and stared at the wall where the stains remained. In the dim light, they seemed to pulse, throbbing as if alive. I finally had enough. I decided to leave early, thinking a good night's sleep in my own bed would chase away the madness. But as I packed, the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I slammed the door behind me and fled into the night, leaving the cabin and its secrets behind. The moment I drove away, the weight lifted, but I could still hear that haunting whisper in my mind. Join us. Story 3. The Uninvited Guest. I was alone at the cabin during a snowstorm when I heard a knock at the door. Peering through the frosted window, I saw a man in tattered clothing, his face obscured by the falling snow. I hesitated, heart racing. The last thing I wanted was to let in a stranger, especially with the weather worsening outside. "Help, please," he called, his voice strained and desperate. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, letting a gust of icy wind blow through. "I'm lost. My car broke down, and I saw your cabin. Can I come in?" He seemed harmless, shivering as he stepped inside, but something about his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. They were too wide, almost unnatural, darting around the room as if searching for something. I offered him a blanket and made some tea, trying to shake the unease that settled in my gut. As we sat by the fire, I asked how he'd gotten lost. He hesitated, then began to tell a story about how he was camping with friends when they had an argument. He wandered off to cool down, but when he turned back, he couldn't find them. The longer he spoke, the more I felt something was off. His eyes flickered to the dark corners of the cabin, and he would smile too wide, revealing teeth that looked too sharp. Hours passed, and the storm raged outside. I suggested he stay the night, thinking it might be safer than letting him wander in the snow. But as I prepared the couch for him, I heard a faint rustle behind me. I turned just in time to see him slip something from his pocket, a small, twisted metal object that glinted in the firelight. "Do you mind if I borrow this?" he asked, a strange grin on his face. I froze, realizing it was one of my tools, a knife I had left on the counter. Panic surged through me. "What are you doing?" Suddenly, he lunged forward, but I managed to shove him away and ran for the door. I barely made it outside when I heard him yell behind me. I sprinted into the woods, the snow crunching underfoot as I heard him following close behind. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys as I glanced back. He was there, standing in the cabin's doorway, watching me with that unnerving smile. I drove away without looking back. The image of his wide eyes burned into my mind. To this day, I wonder what happened to him, and what might have happened to me if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Story 4. The Faded Photograph. While cleaning out the attic of the cabin, I stumbled across a dusty box filled with old photographs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began sifting through the images. Most were of families enjoying their time at the cabin, but one photograph caught my eye. It depicted a family that looked strikingly similar to the one I had seen in town, the very same family that had been staying there a few weeks before. But there was something off about this photograph. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, almost blending in with the forest. I shuddered as I turned the photo over, but there was no date or description, just an eerie sense of déjà vu. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The wind howled outside, and I heard branches scratching against the windows, like fingers beckoning me to look outside. Summoning my courage, I crept to the window and peered into the dark. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed movement among the trees. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was the same figure from the photograph. It stood still, watching the cabin, just as I had seen in the image. I felt a chill race down my spine. I snatched the photograph and ran to the front door, but it swung open with a creak, and I froze. The figure was now standing just beyond the porch, its features still hidden in shadow. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away slowly. Hours passed as I waited for dawn, terrified of what might happen next. As sunlight crept in through the cracks, I mustered the courage to peek outside. The figure was gone, but the photograph was still clutched in my hand. I never returned to the cabin after that night. Some things are better left in the dark. Story 5. The Laughter. I had been working at the cabin for a few months when I first heard the laughter. It was light and playful, echoing through the woods like children at play. At first, I thought nothing of it. Kids often wandered near the lake during summer. But the laughter continued late into the night, growing louder and more frantic. One evening, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I followed the sound, stepping carefully through the underbrush. The laughter grew louder, sounding almost frantic, as if something was terribly wrong. I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight, and what I saw froze me in place. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a group of children, maybe 5 or 6 of them, dancing in circles, their faces obscured by shadows. They looked up at me, their smiles wide, but their eyes were empty, devoid of any real emotion. I called out, asking if they needed help, but their laughter turned to silence, and they stared at me, unmoving. Feeling a chill race down my spine, I turned to leave, but the laughter erupted again, this time sounding sinister. "Stay and play with us." They sang in unison, their voices echoing in the stillness. Panic surged through me, and I ran back to the cabin, the laughter following me until I slammed the door shut. I stayed inside, heart racing, until dawn broke. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something unnatural. The laughter faded away, leaving only an eerie silence. I left the cabin that morning and never looked back, convinced that whatever I had witnessed was best left undiscovered. Story 6. The Rattling Chains. While prepping the cabin for a weekend retreat, I stumbled upon a dusty old chest in the basement. Curiosity piqued. I pried it open and found old chains inside, rusted and heavy. I wondered what they were used for, but an unsettling feeling crept over me. I shut the chest and tried to forget about it. That night, I was awakened by a rattling sound. It was faint at first, like the wind playing tricks, but it grew louder, becoming a cacophony of metal clanging against metal. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement. Gathering my courage, I crept down the stairs, flashlight in hand. As I reached the bottom, the rattling intensified, almost as if someone were dragging the chains across the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. Silence answered. I edged toward the chest, my flashlight being shaking. The chains lay still, untouched. Just as I turned to leave, the rattling began again, but now it was accompanied by low, agonizing moans that seemed to resonate through the very walls. My blood ran cold. I sprinted back up the stairs and slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. The sounds continued throughout the night, growing fainter as dawn approached. I left the cabin at first light, vowing never to return. Whatever had once occupied that space was better left undisturbed. Story 7. The Last Guest. I had taken on a new job as a caretaker for a secluded cabin, and the owner had warned me about the last guest who had stayed there. He didn't go into details, but the way he spoke made my skin crawl. "Just be careful," he said. He was never quite right. Curiosity nagged at me as I cleaned and prepared for the upcoming guests. I found an old journal tucked under the bed, filled with erratic scribbles and frantic drawings. They depicted dark shapes lurking in the woods and notes that mentioned the whispers. It chilled me to the bone, but I felt compelled to read on. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. As the hours passed, I heard faint whispers echoing through the cabin. I strained to listen, but the words were incomprehensible, just an unsettling murmur. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk, hoping to clear my mind. As I ventured into the woods, I felt an invisible weight on my shoulders. The air grew thick, and I began to hear the whispers again, closer this time, as if they were right behind me. I turned back, feeling an urgency in my step. When I reached the cabin, the whispers morphed into laughter, echoing around me. I sprinted inside, locking the door behind me, and huddled against it, heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that the last guest had never truly left. The next day, I packed my things and left, glancing back one last time at the cabin. I felt as though it was watching me, waiting for my return, and I knew I would never come back. Story 8. The Old Music Box. While cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon an ornate music box covered in dust. It looked ancient, and something about it pulled me in. I opened it, and the delicate melody filled the air, soft and haunting. The notes danced around me, tugging at my heartstrings, but with each passing moment, the music grew darker. That night, I left the box on the kitchen table, unable to shake its spell. As I tried to sleep, the melody echoed in my mind, growing louder until it morphed into a cacophony of dissonant notes. I shut up in bed, heart racing, and rushed to the kitchen. To my horror, the music box was playing on its own, the lid wide open. I tried to close it, but my hands were shaking, and the music only grew more frantic. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the music stopped, and I was plunged into silence. I stood frozen, fear gripping me. Then, in the stillness, I heard a whisper, soft yet clear. "Play with me." I bolted out of the cabin, leaving the door wide open, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. The music box stayed behind, its melody lingering in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that resided within the walls. Story 9. The Grinning Face. I had been hired to renovate an old cabin that had sat unused for years. As I began my work, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, faces that seemed to watch me. Most unsettling was a particular face with an unnaturally wide grin. It was as if the wood itself held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. Late one night, I heard a low chuckle echo through the cabin. I shook it off, blaming it on fatigue. But the next night, the laughter returned, louder and more manic. It sent chills down my spine. I decided to investigate, flashlight in hand, but the moment I stepped into the living room, I felt a presence. The grinning face on the wall seemed to twist and warp as if alive. I stared in horror as the eyes followed me, glowing with an unholy light. The laughter turned into a cacophony of voices, all cackling in delight. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the walls seemed to close in around me. Panicking, I ran outside, but the laughter followed, echoing through the trees. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, mocking me. I never returned to that cabin, leaving the grinning face and its twisted laughter behind, but I still hear it sometimes, an echo in the back of my mind. Story 10. The Hidden Door. While clearing out the basement, I discovered a hidden door behind a stack of old crates. It was small and unassuming, covered in dust and cobwebs. Intrigued, I pried it open, revealing a dark passage that seemed to descend into the earth. A chill ran down my spine, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, and the walls were lined with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. As I moved deeper into the passage, I began to hear faint whispers, growing louder with each step. They felt like they were calling to me, urging me to go further. Eventually, I reached a small chamber filled with odd relics and strange markings on the walls. In the center stood an altar, dark and foreboding. My heart raced as I approached, the whispers now a frantic chorus urging me to take something, anything. I reached out for a small, polished stone, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, the whispers turned to screams. I dropped the stone, backing away as the walls began to shake. I bolted back through the passage, stumbling into the light of the basement. I slammed the hidden door shut, feeling the weight of whatever I had disturbed pressing down on me. I never spoke of it to anyone and left the cabin behind, feeling its malevolence lurking just beneath the surface. Story 11. The Forgotten Campfire. I was tasked with prepping a cabin for a group of city dwellers looking for a weekend escape. While cleaning the fire pit outside, I noticed a circle of stones that looked too meticulously arranged to be from nature. They were perfect, almost ritualistic. That night, as I sat on the porch, I felt an inexplicable pull to light a fire. As the flames flickered to life, the woods grew eerily silent. Then, I began to hear whispers drifting through the trees. They sounded like children's voices, giggling and playing, urging me to join them. Curiosity got the better of me, and I called out, "Is someone there?" The whispers intensified, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Suddenly, the laughter turned into frantic screams, echoing in my ears. I jumped to my feet, the fire casting shadows that danced menacingly around me. I snuffed out the flames and fled inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I could hear the whispers growing louder, pounding against the walls like a storm. In the morning, I found the stones arranged differently, forming a perfect circle that now seemed to pulse with energy. I left the cabin that day, vowing never to return, haunted by the laughter that would forever linger in my mind. Story 12. The Shadow in the Corner. While working as a caretaker, I was tasked with maintaining a cabin that had been left abandoned for years. As I cleaned, I noticed a shadow flickering in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight. I shrugged it off as fatigue, but it didn't stop. That night, while I attempted to sleep, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned on the light, but the feeling only intensified. Then I caught a glimpse of it. A dark figure standing in the corner of the room, just outside the beam of my flashlight. I blinked, and it was gone. But I could still feel its presence, a heavy weight pressing down on me. Desperate for sleep, I closed my eyes, but every time I did, the figure returned, closer and more defined. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and clammy. In the early morning light, I gathered my things and left the cabin, but the feeling of dread followed me. I never spoke of it, but I could feel the shadow lingering in my thoughts, always just out of reach, waiting for the night to fall. Story 13. The Old Toy. While cleaning out a storage room in the cabin, I discovered an old dusty toy. A wooden puppet with glassy eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Intrigued, I took it with me, not thinking much of it. That night, I set the puppet on the table, its eyes staring blankly at me. As I lay in bed, I was awoken by the sound of wood creaking. I sat up, heart racing, and glanced toward the table. The puppet was gone. I crept out of bed and searched the cabin, but it was nowhere to be found. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a soft giggle from the living room. My blood ran cold. I edged toward the sound, and there it was, the puppet, now positioned on the couch, its wooden limbs bent in an unnatural way. The giggle came again, followed by a whisper, "Play with me." Panicking, I rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. I could hear the sound of tiny footsteps pacing outside my door. I huddled in the corner, my heart pounding, praying for morning to come. As the sun broke through the window, the footsteps stopped, and I dared to open the door. The puppet was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lurking in the shadows. Story 14, The Hollow Tree. I had been hired to clear the area around a cabin, which meant cutting down overgrown branches and removing fallen trees. As I worked, I came across a massive hollow tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted. Something about it seemed off, as if it were alive and watching me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something. Lying in bed, I began to hear a soft thumping sound outside. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. I peered through the window and saw the hollow tree illuminated by moonlight, and the thumping grew louder. Summoning my courage, I stepped outside. The sound was now accompanied by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. As I approached the tree, I noticed dark shapes writhing inside the hollow, flickering in and out of view. I felt drawn to it, but instinctively took a step back. Suddenly, the growling stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the woods. I bolted back inside the cabin, locking the door tight. I didn't sleep that night, terrified of what I had awakened. The next morning, I left without looking back, leaving the hollow tree and its dark secrets behind. Story 15, The Broken Mirror. While cleaning the cabin, I found an ornate mirror tucked away in a closet. Its frame was cracked, and the glass was foggy. When I wiped it clean, I noticed something odd. My reflection seemed slightly delayed, as if it were a moment behind me. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt compelled to look into the mirror again. I switched on the light, and my reflection stared back, but then it grinned, a sinister, unnerving grin that I didn't make. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the reflection continued to smile as if taunting me. I turned off the light, but the feeling of being watched grew. In the dark, I could hear whispering emanating from the mirror, a soft, seductive voice beckoning me to return. I was terrified, but also drawn to it. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I wrapped it up and stored it in the shed, but the whispers continued, echoing in my mind. I left the cabin that day, never to return, haunted by the memory of that broken mirror and the darkness that resided within it. Story 16, The Missing Keys. While preparing the cabin for a new group of guests, I realized the keys were missing. I searched everywhere, retracing my steps, but they were nowhere to be found. Frustrated, I grabbed a spare key from the toolbox and let myself inside. That night, as I was settling in, I heard a loud clattering sound from the kitchen. It sounded like metal hitting the floor. I rushed to see what had happened, but nothing was out of place. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted the original set of keys lying on the counter, glimmering in the dim light. I picked them up, puzzled. I had searched that very spot a moment ago. Shaking off the unease, I locked the cabin for the night. But as I lay in bed, I heard the sound again, this time accompanied by soft footsteps pacing the floor. Fear washed over me. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the kitchen. The keys were gone again, but the sound of footsteps continued, moving toward the back door. I froze, heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped, and a low, raspy voice whispered, "Let me in." I bolted back to my room and locked the door, barely able to breathe. I waited for morning, desperate to leave. When daylight broke, I found the keys back on the counter, but I didn't stick around to figure out how they kept vanishing. I left the cabin behind, convinced that something had been trying to reach me. Story 17, The Flickering Light. During my time as a caretaker, I often had to deal with flickering lights in the cabin. At first, I thought it was a simple electrical issue. But the flickering grew worse, always accompanied by a chill in the air. It was as if the cabin itself were alive and trying to communicate. One evening, as I sat by the fire, the lights began to strobe violently. I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room, extinguishing the flames. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, I was met with a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The lights returned to normal, but I felt a presence lingering, an overwhelming sense of dread. I spent the rest of the night on edge, waiting for the lights to flicker again. The next day, I found the cabin's wiring and replaced some old bulbs, thinking that would solve the problem. But as night fell, the lights began to flicker once more, and the figure returned, closer this time. I could almost make out its features, twisted and contorted in pain. I fled the cabin that night, leaving the lights behind, knowing that whatever dwelled there was not ready to let me go. Story 18. The creaking floorboards. As I worked on the cabin, I began to notice the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, even when I was alone. At first, I thought it was just the old wood settling, but the creaks began to take on a rhythm, almost like someone was following me. One night, while cleaning, I heard the creaking start again. I paused, listening intently. It was as if someone was pacing just behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The air felt heavy, and I could feel the presence of something close by. Determined to confront it, I placed my hand on the floor, hoping to feel some connection. The creaking intensified, and a low whisper echoed through the room. "Help me." I jumped back, heart racing. The sound came again, this time more desperate. "Help me." It was a voice, strained and pleading. I ran out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached my car. I left without looking back, the whispers and creaks forever etched in my mind. Story 19. The wet footprints. After a heavy rain, I found wet footprints leading from the lake to the cabin. They were small, as if a child had wandered through the woods, but I hadn't seen any signs of life around. Concerned, I followed the prints, feeling increasingly uneasy. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard soft knocks at the door. My heart raced as I recalled the footprints. I crept to the window and peered out, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the sound of rain pattering against the roof. Then I heard the knocks again, more insistent this time. "Let me in," a child's voice called softly. "I'm lost." I hesitated, torn between my instinct to help and the chill creeping down my spine. I finally opened the door, but there was no one there, just the wet footprints leading away into the woods. Panic surged, and I slammed the door shut, locking it tight. I could still hear the child's voice outside, growing fainter. When morning arrived, I found the footprints leading back to the lake, but there were no signs of a child. I left the cabin, leaving the mystery behind, haunted by the voice that still echoed in my mind. Story 20. The last message. As a caretaker, I often came across old notes left by previous guests. One day, while cleaning out a drawer, I found a crumpled piece of paper. It was a hastily scrawled message. "Get out while you can. It knows you're here." Chilled, I tucked it away, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I heard scratching at the walls, followed by a low growl that reverberated through the cabin. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and switched on the light. The shadows seemed to dance in the corners, and the scratching grew louder. I could feel something lurking just out of sight, watching me. I decided to leave, but when I reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. In that moment, I heard a voice whisper my name, cold and sinister. "Stay with me." The room felt suffocating as I fought against the door. Just as the whispering grew louder, the door finally flung open and I bolted outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, desperate to get away. As I drove off, I glanced back at the cabin, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me leave. I knew I would never return, the message echoing in my mind. "It knows you're here." Story 21. The blood-stained wall. While renovating the cabin, I discovered a wall that had been hastily covered with paint. As I stripped it back, I uncovered dark stains seeping through the wood. The stains resembled splatters, almost like dried blood. I felt an uneasy sensation, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself it was just old water damage. That night, I lay in bed when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the wall. It grew louder, turning into frantic knocks, as if someone was trying to break through. My heart raced, and I felt compelled to investigate. As I approached the wall, I placed my hand against it, and the tapping stopped. I could hear my own breath echoing in the silence, and then a whisper emerged from the shadows. "Help me, please." Terrified, I stumbled back, knowing I had disturbed something dark. The next morning, I sealed the wall with fresh paint, leaving the mystery hidden. I left the cabin that day, haunted by the voice that still lingered in my mind. Story 22. The Haunted Dolls. While cleaning the cabin, I stumbled upon a dusty box filled with old dolls. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I pulled them out, one by one. Something about them felt wrong, like they held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the distinct sound of laughter echoing through the cabin. It was high-pitched and childlike, but it sent chills down my spine. I peered into the living room, where I had left the dolls, and saw them arranged in a circle, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. As I stood frozen, the laughter intensified, turning into a cacophony of giggles. "Play with us," they sang in unison. Panic surged through me, and I bolted back to my room, locking the door tight. The laughter continued throughout the night, growing more sinister. I packed my things at dawn and left the dolls behind, their giggles fading into the woods. I knew I could never return, the echoes of their laughter forever haunting me. Story 23. The Abandoned Cabin. I was exploring the woods near the cabin when I stumbled upon an abandoned structure hidden among the trees. Its windows were boarded up, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Curiosity pulled me inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. Old furniture lay strewn about, and as I ventured deeper, I found strange symbols etched into the walls. My heart raced as I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above. I looked up to see shadows darting across the ceiling. I could hear whispers, growing louder, chanting something I couldn't understand. Terrified, I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in my face. Panic surged as I rattled the door, desperate to escape. The whispers became screams, echoing around me. Just as I thought I'd be trapped forever, the door flew open and I stumbled back into the sunlight. I ran back to my cabin, vowing never to return to that cursed place, the whispers forever etched in my memory. Story 24. The Creature in the Woods. During my time at the cabin, I often heard rustling in the bushes at night. At first, I dismissed it as wildlife, but one evening, I saw something, a large, shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a flashlight, stepping outside. The figure disappeared into the trees as I approached. "Hello," I called, but only silence answered. As I stood there, the rustling grew louder, and I felt a chill in the air. Suddenly, a low growl resonated from the shadows, sending chills down my spine. I turned to flee, but the creature lunged forward, revealing a pair of glowing eyes. I sprinted back to the cabin, heart pounding. I could hear it chasing me, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the night. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight, and huddled in a corner, waiting for morning to break. When dawn finally arrived, I found claw marks on the door and knew I had narrowly escaped whatever prowled the woods. I left the cabin that day, never to return, haunted by the memory of those glowing eyes. Story 25. The Old Photograph. While cleaning the cabin, I found an old, dusty photograph tucked beneath a floorboard. It depicted a family standing in front of the cabin, but their faces were scratched out, leaving only their hollow eyes staring back at me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I lay in bed, I heard faint whispers echoing through the room. "Find us," they pleaded. The sound grew louder, rising to a frantic chorus. I felt a heavy weight on my chest, as if something was pressing down on me. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, where the photograph lay on the table. To my horror, I noticed that the scratched-out faces were now slowly reappearing, their expressions twisted in anguish. Panicking, I grabbed the photo and tore it in half. The whispers stopped, but the silence felt more oppressive than before. I packed my things and fled the cabin, leaving the photograph behind, forever haunted by the voices that demanded to be found. Story 26. The Midnight Caller. While staying at the cabin, I received a series of strange phone calls at night. The caller never spoke, just heavy breathing on the other end. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread grew with each call. One night, I picked up the phone, demanding, "Who is this?" Silence followed, then a soft whisper, "I see you." My heart raced as I hung up, fear coursing through my veins. I glanced out the window, but nothing was there, just darkness. The next night, the calls continued, each time the whisper growing more menacing. "I'm coming for you." I decided to leave, but before I could pack, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside. I rushed to the door, locking it tight, but the whispers grew louder, echoing around me. Just as I thought I would be trapped, the power returned, and the phone rang one last time. "You can't hide." I fled the cabin without looking back, terrified by the voice that haunted my nights. Story 27. The Forgotten Child. While cleaning the attic, I discovered an old toy chest filled with dusty toys. As I rummaged through them, I found a worn teddy bear that seemed to have a life of its own. When I held it, I felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard soft crying coming from the attic. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and crept upstairs. The crying grew louder, and I felt a cold breeze sweep past me, sending chills down my spine. In the attic, I found the teddy bear sitting upright, its glassy eyes locked onto mine. "Help me," it whispered, the voice echoing in the small space. I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the crying stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I grabbed the bear and bolted from the attic, locking the door behind me. I packed my things in a frenzy, leaving the bear behind, terrified by the child's voice that still echoed in my mind. Story 28. The Unseen Watcher. While tending to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. One night, I decided to venture out and face my fears. As I stepped into the darkness, I felt an unseen presence lurking nearby. I called out, "Is anyone there?" But only silence answered. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I turned around, but nothing was there. Panic surged as I sprinted back to the cabin, heart pounding. I locked the door, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I could sense it lurking just outside, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I found strange markings in the dirt around the cabin, symbols I couldn't understand. I left that day, convinced that whatever was watching me was not human, and I knew I would never return. Story 29. The Swamp's Edge. While exploring the woods, I came across a small swamp at the cabin's edge. The water was murky, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. I felt an odd pull to venture closer, but something warned me to stay away. That night, I heard splashing sounds outside, like something moving in the water. I peered out the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then, I heard a soft, melodic voice calling to me from the swamp. "Come play with me." Fear gripped me, and I shut the curtains tight. I could still hear the splashing, growing louder, as if something was approaching the cabin. The voice grew more insistent, pleading, "I just want a friend." I couldn't take it any longer. I bolted to the door and locked it tight, my heart racing. The splashing stopped, but the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. I left the cabin at dawn, the call from the swamp haunting me forever. Story 30. The Echoing Laughter. While preparing the cabin, I found an old radio tucked away in a corner. Curious, I plugged it in, and to my surprise, it crackled to life. I heard a mix of static and laughter, eerie and distant. As I fiddled with the dials, the laughter grew louder, echoing around me. That night, as I lay in bed, the laughter filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls. I felt a chill in the air, and the laughter transformed into mocking whispers. "You shouldn't be here," they taunted. "Join us." Terrified, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the radio, trying to turn it off. The laughter only grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I finally yanked the plug, plunging the cabin into silence. But the laughter remained in my mind, echoing long after I left the cabin, a reminder of the darkness that resided within those walls. I vowed never to return, haunted by the sound that still lingered in the corners of my mind. Story 31. The Whispers in the Walls. During my first week at the cabin, I started hearing whispers echoing through the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but as night fell, the whispers grew more distinct. It was as if someone was having a conversation just beyond the drywall. One evening, I decided to investigate. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to catch the words. The whispers were urgent, filled with emotion. "Help us! Don't let it in. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly retreated to my room, locking the door. That night, I heard soft tapping on the walls, as if someone was trying to break through. The next morning, I found scratches on the wall, deep and jagged. I packed my things and left the cabin, terrified by what might be trapped within those walls, forever whispering for help. Story 32. The Haunting Melody. While cleaning the cabin, I found an old music box tucked away in a dusty drawer. Curious, I wound it up, and a haunting melody filled the air. It was beautiful yet eerie, sending shivers down my spine. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the melody playing again, softly echoing through the cabin. I thought I had left the music box open, but when I checked, it was closed tight. The sound continued, almost as if someone was winding it up from the shadows. Determined to confront it, I stood up and walked to the living room. The music stopped, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. I felt a cold draft sweep through, and the air grew heavy. Suddenly, the melody started again, louder this time, filled with anguish. "Help me!" The notes seemed to cry. Panicking, I grabbed the music box and threw it out the door. The music stopped, but I could still feel the presence lingering. I left the cabin at dawn, the haunting melody echoing in my mind, forever reminding me of what I had unleashed. Story 33. The Strange Occurrences. I took a job at a remote cabin that had a reputation for strange occurrences. Guests often complained of misplaced items, flickering lights, and sudden cold spots. Skeptical, I brushed it off as overactive imaginations. But my first night there, I experienced it firsthand. I woke up to find my flashlight missing, despite having placed it on the nightstand. I searched the cabin, only to find it sitting on the kitchen counter, flickering erratically. That same night, I heard footsteps pacing outside, slow and deliberate. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. I turned back, only to find the lights flickering and the air growing cold. The footsteps grew louder, sounding like they were right outside my door. I locked it tight and spent the night awake, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching me. By morning, I was exhausted and terrified, ready to leave the cabin behind, knowing I had disturbed something that preferred to remain hidden. Story 34. The Doll's Grin. While cleaning out the cabin, I stumbled upon a creepy old doll with a twisted smile. Its eyes seemed to glint in the light, and I felt an uneasy sensation as I picked it up. I decided to leave it for the next guests, thinking it might add to the charm of the place. That night, I heard giggling coming from the living room. I froze, recalling the doll's eerie smile. I crept out of bed and peered into the room, only to find the doll sitting upright on the couch, its grin wider than before. "Play with me," it seemed to say, though it never moved its mouth. Panic surged through me, and I dashed back to my room, locking the door. The giggling continued, echoing through the cabin until I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I found the doll back on the shelf, as if nothing had happened. I left the cabin that day, vowing to never return, haunted by the memory of that chilling grin. Story 35. The Mysterious Book. While organizing the shelves, I found an old leather-bound book filled with strange symbols and notes. Intrigued, I began to read, but the words were incomprehensible, like an ancient language. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a strange energy coursing through me. That night, I heard the book whispering my name, pulling me from my sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound to the living room, where the book lay open on the table. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating with a life of their own. "Join us," the whispers called, and I felt a tugging sensation, as if something wanted to pull me inside the pages. Terrified, I slammed the book shut, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a chaotic symphony of voices. I packed my things and fled the cabin, leaving the book behind, forever haunted by the knowledge that I had stumbled upon something ancient and dark. Story 36. The Swamp Thing. While exploring the woods, I stumbled upon a murky swamp that gave off an unsettling vibe. I felt an inexplicable urge to investigate, but as I stepped closer, I noticed a figure lurking in the water, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. That night, I heard splashes coming from the swamp, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. A soft voice called out, "Help me, please." It was haunting, echoing through the trees, and I felt drawn to it. When I peeked outside, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the swamp, beckoning me to come closer. "Don't be afraid," it whispered, but the warning bells in my head screamed otherwise. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. The voice grew more frantic, desperate for rescue. I spent the night awake, terrified of what might emerge from the swamp. When dawn finally broke, I left the cabin behind, vowing never to return, haunted by the creatures pleading. Story 37. The Scent of Roses. While cleaning the cabin, I noticed a faint scent of roses permeating the air. It was pleasant at first, but as the days went on, it grew heavier and more suffocating. The scent seemed to cling to everything, even invading my dreams. That night, I was awoken by the overwhelming aroma, so strong that it felt like I was suffocating. I got out of bed and followed the scent to the living room, where I found a bouquet of roses lying on the table, fresh and vibrant, despite no one having been there. As I reached for the flowers, the scent turned bitter, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. "Stay with me," a voice whispered, sending chills down my spine. I backed away, heart pounding, and fled back to my room, locking the door tight. The scent lingered all night, filling my lungs with dread. When morning arrived, I found the roses gone, but the scent still clung to the cabin. I left that day, haunted by the memory of the roses and the voice that begged me to stay. Story 38. The Old Key. While organizing the storage room, I found an ornate key buried beneath a pile of junk. It was heavy, intricately designed, and gave off an unsettling energy. I couldn't help but wonder what it unlocked, but a part of me feared what I might find. That night, I heard the sound of metal scraping against wood. I was immediately on edge, realizing it was coming from the locked cellar door. I felt drawn to it, the key pulsing in my pocket. I hesitated, but curiosity overcame my fear. I approached the cellar door, inserting the key. As it turned, a cold breeze rushed past me, sending shivers down my spine. I opened the door, revealing a dark, musty staircase that led into the depths below. As I descended, the air grew heavier, and I heard whispers rising from the darkness. "Let us out," they pleaded, a chorus of voices echoing in my ears. Terrified, I fled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I left the cabin that day, leaving the key behind, haunted by the whispers that begged for release. Story 39. The Eerie Photograph. While cleaning up the living room, I found an old photograph of a family standing in front of the cabin. The moment I looked at it, a shiver ran down my spine. There was something off about the picture. Their smiles seemed forced, and their eyes held a darkness that sent chills through me. That night, I hung the photograph back on the wall, but as I lay in bed, I heard faint whispers coming from it. "Help us," the voices cried, growing more desperate. I sat up, heart racing, and peered into the living room. To my horror, the photograph had changed. The family was now staring directly at me, their expressions twisted in anguish. I could hear them pleading, "Join us." Panicking, I ripped the photograph off the wall and threw it outside. But the whispers persisted, echoing in my mind. I left the cabin that morning, never looking back, haunted by the faces trapped within that photograph. Story 40. The Candlelight Vigil. While cleaning the cabin, I discovered an old dusty candle sitting on the mantel. Curious, I lit it, and the flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the walls. It felt comforting at first, but soon the shadows twisted into dark shapes, dancing menacingly. That night, I was awoken by a soft whispering echoing through the cabin. The candle had burned low, but the flame flickered wildly, illuminating the shadows. I could hear voices chanting, growing louder with each passing moment. "Join us in the light." Terrified, I blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, filling the cabin with chaos. I scrambled to find my flashlight, the shadows closing in around me. When the light flickered on, the whispers fell silent, but I could still feel their presence, pressing against me. I left the cabin at dawn, the memory of that candle and the voices echoing in my mind, forever reminding me of what I had encountered. Story 41. The Creaking Floorboards. On my first night at the cabin, I noticed the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. Each sound felt amplified in the silence, echoing through the rooms. As I settled into bed, I'd heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking around downstairs. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the staircase. The creaking continued, almost rhythmically, as if someone was pacing back and forth. "Hello," I called out, but only silence greeted me in return. I made my way down the stairs, shining the light around. The living room was empty, but the creaking persisted, growing louder as I approached the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, it swung open with a deafening creak, revealing nothing but darkness. I bolted back upstairs, locking the door tight, and spent the rest of the night listening to the footsteps echoing in the cabin. In the morning, I found a pair of muddy footprints leading up to the door, but no one was around. I left the cabin shaken, never wanting to hear those floorboards creak again. Story 42. The Shadow in the Woods. While hiking in the woods, I often caught glimpses of a dark figure flitting between the trees. I brushed it off as my imagination, but each time I felt eyes watching me, an unsettling chill crawled down my spine. One evening, while preparing dinner, I saw the shadow again, closer this time, lurking just beyond the tree line. It seemed to be waiting for me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to approach. My heart raced as I stepped outside, drawn by an inexplicable force. As I neared the woods, the figure darted away, leading me deeper into the darkness. I followed, adrenaline coursing through me, until I found myself at the edge of a clearing. The figure stood just out of reach, its form obscured by the trees. "Help me," it whispered, voice echoing through the silence. I froze, fear gripping me. The shadow seemed to merge with the darkness, and I turned to run, the sound of footsteps chasing me back to the cabin. I locked the door, heart racing, knowing I had escaped something I didn't understand. Story 43. The Forbidden Room. While cleaning, I noticed a door that had been tightly shut, the wood weathered and worn. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open. Inside was a small room filled with dusty furniture and cobwebs, untouched by time. As I stepped inside, I felt an unnatural chill, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged as I rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air thickened, and I could hear whispering coming from the corners of the room. "You shouldn't be here." In the dim light, I saw an old mirror reflecting not my own image, but a figure standing behind me, a woman in tattered clothes, her face twisted in sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, reaching out with a ghostly hand. Terrified, I finally managed to force the door open and stumbled back into the hallway. I never went back to that room, but the whispers lingered in my mind, echoing the woman's plea for help. Story 44. The Lantern's Light. One evening, I discovered an old lantern hanging on the porch. Intrigued, I lit it, and a warm glow filled the area. It felt inviting, but as night fell, the light flickered ominously. That night, while trying to sleep, I heard soft tapping at the window. I opened my eyes to see shadows dancing outside, illuminated by the lantern's glow. I felt a pull to get up and look, but something held me back. Suddenly, the light flickered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The tapping grew louder, frantic, almost desperate. "Let me in," a voice called, echoing through the night. I scrambled to find my flashlight, and as the beam cut through the darkness, I saw nothing outside. The tapping stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered. I spent the rest of the night awake, the lantern now a symbol of the darkness that sought to invade. Story 45. The Unseen Child. While cleaning the cabin, I often heard the sound of childish laughter echoing through the halls. I assumed it was my imagination, but one night the laughter grew louder, filling the air with joy. I followed the sound to the living room, where I found an old rocking chair swaying gently back and forth, despite the lack of a breeze. The laughter grew more intense, and I felt a pull to sit in the chair. As I approached, the laughter turned into sobs, echoing around me. "Help me, I'm lost," a voice cried out. Panic gripped me, and I backed away, feeling a cold breath against my neck. I bolted back to my room, locking the door. The sobbing continued, echoing in my mind until dawn broke. I left the cabin, leaving the laughter behind, forever haunted by the unseen child that had called for help. Story 46. The Markings on the Trees. While hiking through the woods, I noticed strange markings carved into the trees. They looked like symbols, old and weathered. I felt a chill as I traced my fingers over them, an unsettling feeling creeping in. That night, I had vivid dreams of the woods, filled with whispers and shadows. When I woke up, I noticed new markings had appeared on the trees surrounding the cabin. They were fresh, as if someone or something had been watching me. The next day, I tried to leave, but the paths seemed to shift, leading me in circles. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in a maze of trees. The whispers grew louder, urging me to stay. You belong to us. In a surge of adrenaline, I broke through the underbrush and stumbled back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I spent the night awake, haunted by the markings that seemed to claim me as one of their own. Story 47. The Fog. One morning, a thick fog enveloped the cabin, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt a sense of unease as I stepped outside, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. As I walked, I heard distant whispers carried by the wind, calling my name. Come closer, they urged, beckoning me deeper into the fog. I hesitated, fear gripping my heart, but curiosity pushed me forward. The whispers grew louder, and I saw shadowy figures moving through the mist, their shapes shifting and flickering. Join us, they chanted, the fog swirling around me, making it hard to breathe. I turned to run, but the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Finally, I broke free and dashed back to the cabin, slamming the door shut. The whispers faded, but the fog lingered in my mind, a reminder of the unknown that awaited outside. Story 48. The Blood Moon. On a particularly eerie night, a blood moon hung in the sky, casting a crimson glow over the cabin. I felt a strange energy pulsing through the air, and that evening, I noticed odd behavior from the wildlife. Animals were unusually quiet, their eyes wide with fear. As night fell, I heard chanting coming from the woods. Drawn by the sound, I stepped outside, only to be enveloped by an unsettling silence. The woods felt alive, watching me. The moonlight cast long shadows, and I felt a cold breeze sweep through, carrying whispers of incantations. Suddenly, I saw figures emerging from the trees, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved in a slow procession toward the clearing, and I felt a deep sense of dread. Join us, they beckoned, their voices echoing through the night. I turned to run back to the cabin, heart racing, locking the door behind me. I spent the night trembling, the chanting echoing in my ears, knowing I had narrowly escaped something dark and ancient. Story 49. The Old Swing. While exploring the yard, I found an old swing hanging from a gnarled tree. It swayed gently, despite the lack of wind. I couldn't resist the urge to sit down and pushed off the ground, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over me. As I swung, I began to hear laughter, a child's laughter, echoing around me. It was joyful and carefree, but there was an undercurrent of sadness. Play with me, a voice called, drawing me in. Suddenly, the swing began to move faster, almost on its own. I felt a rush of wind around me, and the laughter turned into pleading cries. Don't leave me, the voice begged, sending chills down my spine. I leaped off the swing and stumbled back, breathless. I turned to run, the laughter fading into desperate sobs. I packed my things and left the cabin behind, the swing and the child's voice haunting my thoughts. Story 50. The Final Encounter. On my last night at the cabin, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick, and I could hear whispers in the wind, beckoning me to stay. You can't leave, they echoed, sending chills down my spine. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, but the whispers grew louder, filling my dreams with images of the cabin and the dark figures lurking just outside. I woke up to a loud bang on the door, followed by frantic scratching. Let us in, the voices cried, a chorus of despair. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and dashed to the door. The scratching continued, relentless, as I pressed my back against the wall. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I flung open the door and was met with a blinding light, blurring my vision. As it faded, I found myself standing in the clearing, surrounded by the shadows of the figures I had seen before. Join us, they whispered, and I felt the pull of their energy. But I fought back, breaking free and running into the woods. I stumbled through the trees, finally reaching my car as dawn broke. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, now just a silhouette against the rising sun. I knew I had escaped, but the whispers and shadows would haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurked in that cabin in the woods. Story 51. The Hidden Diary. While cleaning out an old drawer in the cabin, I stumbled upon a dusty diary. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. Curiosity got the best of me, and I began to read. The entries detailed strange happenings, shadows moving in the corners, disembodied whispers at night, and an ominous presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The last entry was frantic, warning of a dark entity that hungered for souls. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard scratching at the walls, just as described in the diary. "Let me in," a voice whispered, sending chills down my spine. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the scratching continued, growing more insistent. Unable to take it anymore, I grabbed the diary and tossed it outside, desperate to rid myself of its influence. The scratching stopped, but the unease lingered. I left the cabin at dawn, haunted by the diary's chilling revelations. Story 52. The Uninvited Guest. One evening, while settling down for the night, I heard a knock on the door. It was strange to receive visitors in such a remote area. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch, drenched and shivering. Her clothes were tattered, and her eyes held a haunting sadness. "Please, may I come in?" she asked softly. I hesitated but allowed her inside, offering her a warm drink. As she sat by the fire, I noticed her reflection in the window, except she wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I turned back to her. "Who are you?" Her expression changed to one of desperation. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice fading. Suddenly, she vanished, leaving only a cold draft behind. That night, I heard whispers echoing through the cabin. "You let her in," they taunted. I spent the night awake, haunted by the knowledge that I had invited something otherworldly into my home. Story 53. The Gnarled Tree. While exploring the grounds, I came across a gnarled tree twisted and bent in unnatural ways. Its bark was dark and rough, and I felt an inexplicable urge to touch it. As I ran my fingers along the trunk, a wave of dizziness washed over me. That night, I had a vivid dream of the tree. In it, I saw shadowy figures emerging from the roots, whispering secrets and begging for release. "Help us," they cried, their voices echoing in my mind. I woke up in a cold sweat, the image of the tree burned into my memory. The next day, I found myself drawn back to it, as if it were calling me. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, promising power and knowledge if I only listened. Fighting against the pull, I turned away, but the whispers grew frantic. "You're ours," they echoed, sending chills down my spine. I fled the cabin that day, leaving the tree behind, knowing it held a dark secret. Story 54. The Portraits. As I cleaned the cabin, I discovered a series of portraits hanging in the hallway. Each painting depicted a person with hollow eyes and eerie smiles. The longer I stared, the more I felt their gazes bore into me. That night, I awoke to find the portraits missing. In their place were dark shadows that seemed to writhe and twist along the walls. I felt a chill creep over me, and the air grew heavy with dread. Suddenly, I heard laughter echoing through the cabin. "Come play with us," it beckoned, the voices of children mixing with those of adults. I felt an overwhelming sense of panic as I realized the portraits had come to life. I stumbled out of bed, racing to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter grew louder, filling my ears with chaos. Finally, I managed to force the door open and fled into the night, leaving the cabin behind, the laughter echoing in my mind. Story 55. The Scrying Mirror. While cleaning the cabin, I found an ornate mirror covered in dust. Curious, I wiped it clean and looked into it, but my reflection seemed distorted, the colors swirling unnaturally. That night, I awoke to find the mirror glowing softly. I felt drawn to it, as if it were calling my name. As I approached, my reflection began to change, revealing scenes of the past, figures moving in the shadows, their faces twisted in anguish. "Help us," they whispered, reaching out as if to escape the mirror's grasp. I felt a cold wind sweep through the cabin, and the reflections grew more frantic. Terrified, I turned to run, but the mirror's energy held me in place. "Stay with us," they begged, their voices melding into a cacophony of sorrow. I broke free and fled the cabin, leaving the mirror behind, haunted by the echoes of the trapped cells. Story 56. The Haunting Melody, Part I. Remembering the old music box I had found, I decided to retrieve it and see if it had any connection to the whispers I had heard before. As I wound it up, The haunting melody filled the air, stirring something deep within me. That night, the music played again, soft and alluring. I felt a strange compulsion to follow it outside. As I stepped onto the porch, the moonlight illuminated the woods, casting eerie shadows. Suddenly, the melody changed, becoming discordant and twisted. "Join us." The notes seemed to plead, and I felt a presence creeping closer, wrapping around me like a fog. I snapped back to reality, realizing the music had become a siren's call, luring me into the darkness. I bolted back inside, slamming the door, but the music echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the entity that sought to claim me. Story 57. The Return of the Fog. One evening, the fog returned, thicker than before. It rolled in silently, swallowing the cabin whole. I felt an inexplicable fear as the whispers returned, echoing through the thick mist. "Come play with us." They beckoned. I tried to ignore it, but the fog seeped through the cracks, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. Just then, I heard laughter, followed by a child's voice calling out, "I'm lost." Panic surged through me as I stumbled toward the sound, feeling an invisible pull. The laughter turned sinister, echoing in the fog. "Stay with us, forever." I broke free and ran back to the cabin, locking the door tight. The fog pressed against the windows, and the whispers grew louder, filling my mind with dread. I spent the night trembling, knowing the fog was not just a natural phenomenon. It was a trap, waiting to ensnare its next victim. Story 58. The Last Guest. On my final night at the cabin, I prepared to leave early in the morning. As I packed, I heard a knock on the door. I hesitated, recalling my previous experiences. "Who is it?" I called out, but there was no response. The knock came again, more insistent. My heart raced as I approached the door, uncertain of what awaited me. I opened it slowly, revealing a man standing on the porch, his face pale and gaunt. "Help me," he whispered, eyes wide with fear. "I'm trapped here." Before I could react, the wind howled, and the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to find the man standing in the middle of the room, his form flickering like a candle flame. "You shouldn't have let me in." I felt a cold wave wash over me, and the whispers filled the air. "Join us," they chanted, a chorus of lost souls. I stumbled back, terrified, as the man's expression twisted into a grimace. With a surge of adrenaline, I dashed past him and fled into the night, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind. Story 59. The Last Lights. The power went out one stormy night, plunging the cabin into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, feeling the oppressive silence close in around me. As I switched it on, I noticed shadows moving across the walls, dancing in the flickering beam. Suddenly, I heard laughter echoing from the corners of the room. "Play with us." The voices chimed, playful yet chilling. My heart raced as I realized the shadows were forming into shapes, mimicking children at play. "Join us," they called, their laughter turning sinister. I felt the air grow heavy, as if the cabin itself were alive, watching me. With a rush of fear, I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into complete darkness. The laughter ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence. I stood frozen, knowing I had angered whatever had lurked in the shadows. Finally, I flicked the light back on, but the room was empty. The laughter faded, leaving only the echo of my racing heartbeat. I spent the night awake, terrified of what might emerge in the darkness. Story 46. The Markings on the Trees. While hiking through the woods, I noticed strange markings carved into the trees. It looked like symbols, old and weathered. I felt a chill as I traced my fingers over them, an unsettling feeling creeping in. That night, I had vivid dreams of the woods, filled with whispers and shadows. When I woke up, I noticed new markings had appeared on the trees surrounding the cabin. They were fresh, as if someone or something had been watching me. The next day, I tried to leave, but the paths seemed to shift, leading me in circles. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in a maze of trees. The whispers grew louder, urging me to stay. "You belong to us." In a surge of adrenaline, I broke through the underbrush and stumbled back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I spent the night awake, haunted by the markings that seemed to claim me as one of their own. Story 47. The Fog. One morning, a thick fog enveloped the cabin, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt a sense of unease as I stepped outside, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. As I walked, I heard distant whispers carried by the wind, calling my name. "Come closer," they urged, beckoning me deeper into the fog. I hesitated, fear gripping my heart, but curiosity pushed me forward. The whispers grew louder, and I saw shadowy figures moving through the mist, their shapes shifting and flickering. "Join us," they chanted, the fog swirling around me, making it hard to breathe. I turned to run, but the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Finally, I broke free and dashed back to the cabin, slamming the door shut. The whispers faded, but the fog lingered in my mind, a reminder of the unknown that awaited outside. Story 48. The Blood Moon. On a particularly eerie night, a blood moon hung in the sky, casting a crimson glow over the cabin. I felt a strange energy pulsing through the air, and that evening, I noticed odd behavior from the wildlife. Animals were unusually quiet, their eyes wide with fear. As night fell, I heard chanting coming from the woods. Drawn by the sound, I stepped outside, only to be enveloped by an unsettling silence. The woods felt alive, watching me. The moonlight cast long shadows, and I felt a cold breeze sweep through, carrying whispers of incantations. Suddenly, I saw figures emerging from the trees, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved in a slow procession toward the clearing, and I felt a deep sense of dread. "Join us," they beckoned, their voices echoing through the night. I turned to run back to the cabin, heart racing, locking the door behind me. I spent the night trembling, the chanting echoing in my ears, knowing I had narrowly escaped something dark and ancient. Story 49. The Old Swing. While exploring the yard, I found an old swing hanging from a gnarled tree. It swayed gently, despite the lack of wind. I couldn't resist the urge to sit down and pushed off the ground, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over me. As I swung, I began to hear laughter, a child's laughter, echoing around me. It was joyful and carefree, but there was an undercurrent of sadness. "Play with me," a voice called, drawing me in. Suddenly, the swing began to move faster, almost on its own. I felt a rush of wind around me, and the laughter turned into pleading cries. "Don't leave me," the voice begged, sending chills down my spine. I leaped off the swing and stumbled back, breathless. I turned to run, the laughter fading into desperate sobs. I packed my things and left the cabin behind, the swing and the child's voice haunting my thoughts. Story 38. The Old Key. While organizing the storage room, I found an ornate key buried beneath a pile of junk. It was heavy, intricately designed, and gave off an unsettling energy. I couldn't help but wonder what it unlocked, but a part of me feared what I might find. That night, I heard the sound of metal scraping against wood. I was immediately on edge, realizing it was coming from the locked cellar door. I felt drawn to it, the key pulsing in my pocket. I hesitated, but curiosity overcame my fear. I approached the cellar door, inserting the key. As it turned, a cold breeze rushed past me, sending shivers down my spine. I opened the door, revealing a dark, musty staircase that led into the depths below. As I descended, the air grew heavier, and I heard whispers rising from the darkness. "Let us out," they pleaded, a chorus of voices echoing in my ears. Terrified, I fled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I left the cabin that day, leaving the key behind, haunted by the whispers that begged for release. Story 39. The Eerie Photograph. While cleaning up the living room, I found an old photograph of a family standing in front of the cabin. The moment I looked at it, a shiver ran down my spine. There was something off about the picture. Their smiles seemed forced, and their eyes held a darkness that sent chills through me. That night, I hung the photograph back on the wall, but as I lay in bed, I heard faint whispers coming from it. "Help us," the voices cried, growing more desperate. I sat up, heart racing, and peered into the living room. To my horror, the photograph had changed. The family was now staring directly at me, their expressions twisted in anguish. I could hear them pleading, "Join us." Panicking, I ripped the photograph off the wall and threw it outside, but the whispers persisted, echoing in my mind. I left the cabin that morning, never looking back, haunted by the faces trapped within that photograph. Story 40. The Candlelight Vigil. While cleaning the cabin, I discovered an old, dusty candle sitting on the mantel. Curious, I lit it, and the flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the walls. It felt comforting at first, but soon the shadows twisted into dark shapes, dancing menacingly. That night, I was awoken by a soft whispering echoing through the cabin. The candle had burned low, but the flame flickered wildly, illuminating the shadows. I could hear voices chanting, growing louder with each passing moment. "Join us in the light." Terrified, I blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, filling the cabin with chaos. I scrambled to find my flashlight, the shadows closing in around me. When the light flickered on, the whispers fell silent, but I could still feel their presence, pressing against me. I left the cabin at dawn, the memory of that candle and the voices echoing in my mind, forever reminding me of what I had encountered. Story 41. The creaking floorboards. On my first night at the cabin, I noticed the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. Each sound felt amplified in the silence, echoing through the rooms. As I settled into bed, I'd heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking around downstairs. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the staircase. The creaking continued, almost rhythmically, as if someone was pacing back and forth. "Hello!" I called out, but only silence greeted me in return. I made my way down the stairs, shining the light around. The living room was empty, but the creaking persisted, growing louder as I approached the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, it swung open with a deafening creak, revealing nothing but darkness. I bolted back upstairs, locking the door tight, and spent the rest of the night listening to the footsteps echoing in the cabin. In the morning, I found a pair of muddy footprints leading up to the door, but no one was around. I left the cabin shaken, never wanting to hear those floorboards creak again. Story 29. The Swamp's Edge. While exploring the woods, I came across a small swamp at the cabin's edge. The water was murky, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. I felt an odd pull to venture closer, but something warned me to stay away. That night, I heard splashing sounds outside, like something moving in the water. I peered out the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then, I heard a soft, melodic voice calling to me from the swamp. "Come play with me." Fear gripped me, and I shut the curtains tight. I could still hear the splashing, growing louder, as if something was approaching the cabin. The voice grew more insistent, pleading, "I just want a friend." I couldn't take it any longer. I bolted to the door and locked it tight, my heart racing. The splashing stopped, but the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. I left the cabin at dawn, the call from the swamp haunting me forever. Story 30. The Echoing Laughter. While preparing the cabin, I found an old radio tucked away in a corner. Curious, I plugged it in, and to my surprise, it crackled to life. I heard a mix of static and laughter, eerie and distant. As I fiddled with the dials, the laughter grew louder, echoing around me. That night, as I lay in bed, the laughter filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls. I felt a chill in the air, and the laughter transformed into mocking whispers. "You shouldn't be here," they taunted. "Join us." Terrified, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the radio, trying to turn it off. The laughter only grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I finally yanked the plug, plunging the cabin into silence. But the laughter remained in my mind, echoing long after I left the cabin, a reminder of the darkness that resided within those walls. I vowed never to return, haunted by the sound that still lingered in the corners of my mind. Story 31. The Whispers in the Walls. During my first week at the cabin, I started hearing whispers echoing through the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but as night fell, the whispers grew more distinct. It was as if someone was having a conversation just beyond the drywall. One evening, I decided to investigate. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to catch the words. The whispers were urgent, filled with emotion. "Help us! Don't let it in!" Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly retreated to my room, locking the door. That night, I heard soft tapping on the walls, as if someone was trying to break through. The next morning, I found scratches on the wall, deep and jagged. I packed my things and left the cabin, terrified by what might be trapped within those walls, forever whispering for help. Story 32. The Haunting Melody. While cleaning the cabin, I found an old music box tucked away in a dusty drawer. Curious, I wound it up, and a haunting melody filled the air. It was beautiful yet eerie, sending shivers down my spine. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the melody playing again, softly echoing through the cabin. I thought I had left the music.